Leo Tolstoy had everything that most people spend their lives chasing: wealth, recognition, a loving family, and a literary legacy that had already cemented his name in history. His novels, War and Peace and Anna Karenina, were hailed as masterpieces, admired by intellectuals and common readers alike. Yet, at the height of his success, a question began to torment him, a question so profound that it threatened to unravel the very fabric of his existence. What is the meaning of life if everything ends in death? This wasn't just a passing philosophical curiosity. It was an existential crisis that consumed him entirely. He achieved. No matter how much he loved or was loved, death would eventually erase it all. He compared life to a traveler lost in a forest, running from an inevitable beast, death, while clinging desperately to a fragile branch above a deep abyss. His success had brought him no comfort, no lasting satisfaction. Instead, it had only intensified the void within him. How could it be that a man who had everything felt like he had nothing? What was the point of all his achievements if, in the grand scheme of things, they were destined to disappear? This was not just Tolstoy's question. It is the unspoken fear that lingers in the minds of countless people who have reached their goals, only to find themselves more lost than before. Tolstoy sought refuge in intellectual pursuits, turning to philosophy, science, and logic in search of an answer. He studied the works of great thinkers, Schopenhauer, Kant, and the existentialists, hoping that their wisdom would provide a sense of direction. Yet, the more he read, the deeper his despair grew. Philosophy dissected life, analyzed morality, and debated the nature of existence, but none of it offered a solution that truly satisfied him. Science was even more unforgiving, reducing life to a mere accident of biology, governed by cold, indifferent laws of nature. He realized that reason alone could not answer the question that tormented him. Why do we live if we must inevitably die? Rationality, instead of alleviating his suffering, only amplified his anguish. If everything was destined to end, if every love, every joy, every triumph would be wiped away by time, then what purpose could there possibly be? Tolstoy saw two logical responses to this dilemma: either to accept that life was ultimately meaningless and resign himself to despair, or to end his own life to escape the unbearable absurdity of existence. He was drawn to the latter, admitting in his confession that he had to hide ropes from himself and avoid carrying a gun, for fear that he might act on his suicidal thoughts. This was not mere dramatic exaggeration. It was the logical consequence of his realization that, in a purely rational framework, life had no ultimate meaning. But despite his despair, he clung to life. Something within him refused to accept that meaning was just an illusion. And so, instead of surrendering, he turned his gaze toward something he had long ignored: the people who lived without wealth, without fame, without intellectual sophistication, and yet, somehow, seemed at peace. As Tolstoy observed the world around him, he became increasingly fascinated by the lives of simple, working-class people: farmers, peasants, laborers. These were individuals who, by all rational measures, should have been more despairing than him. They had no luxuries, no great intellectual achievements, no lasting legacy, and yet they lived with a quiet contentment, accepting life as it was, embracing its struggles and joys with a sense of purpose that eluded him. What did they know that he didn't? Unlike the intellectual elite, these people did not seek meaning through abstract reasoning or philosophical speculation. They lived their meaning. They found it in their families, in their traditions, in their connection to the land and to each other. They did not ask whether life had meaning. They simply lived as if it did. Tolstoy was struck by the realization that these people did not need the kind of certainty he had been desperately chasing. They embraced mystery, they accepted suffering, and most importantly, they did not fear death in the same way he did. Their faith in something greater than themselves, whether it was God, tradition, or the natural rhythm of life, gave them a sense of purpose that he, despite all his knowledge and success, had never truly experienced. For years, Tolstoy had sought answers in places where they could never be found. He had believed that meaning had to be a logically provable concept, something that could be written in a book or explained by a philosopher. But now he realized that meaning was not an intellectual construct. It was a lived experience. This revelation did not come as a sudden epiphany, but rather as a slow transformation. The more time he spent among simple people, the more he saw that their peace was not rooted in material success or intellectual superiority, but in their ability to surrender to life rather than resist it. They embraced something greater than themselves, whether it was faith, love, or a sense of duty, and in doing so, they were freed from the existential torment that had nearly destroyed him. Tolstoy began to see that the real illusion was not meaninglessness, but the belief that meaning could only exist if it was absolute, eternal, and logically irrefutable. Life, he realized, does not need to be justified by reason alone. It can be justified by love, by connection, by the simple act of living fully. This realization marked the beginning of a profound shift in his philosophy, one that would lead him to renounce his former values and seek a deeper, more authentic way of living. But his journey was far from over. The next question was inevitable. If wealth, fame, and intellectual achievement had failed him, what then was truly worth pursuing? And so, Tolstoy ventured deeper into the unknown, searching for an answer that could finally bring him the peace he had spent a lifetime chasing. At first glance, Tolstoy's life was a portrait of fulfillment. He had risen from the nobility to become one of the most celebrated writers in history. His books were read across Europe, admired by intellectuals, and praised as some of the greatest literary works ever written. His wealth afforded him a comfortable life, far from the struggles of ordinary men. His name carried weight. His influence stretched beyond literature into politics and philosophy. If there was ever a man who had every reason to feel satisfied, it was him. And yet, he was drowning in despair. The more success he attained, the more hollow it felt. He compared his life to a man running toward a mirage, believing he was about to reach an oasis, only to find nothing but sand slipping through his fingers. He had achieved everything society told him was valuable, yet instead of fulfillment, he found only emptiness. His books, his legacy, his fame, none of it answered the question that haunted him. Why does any of this matter if death will erase it all? The illusion that success would bring meaning had shattered before his eyes. He realized that his achievements were like castles built on the shore, beautiful yet fragile, destined to be washed away by time. This understanding did not come as an intellectual insight, but as an existential wound that grew deeper with each passing day. He could not escape it, nor could he rationalize it away. His life had become a contradiction, externally prosperous, internally crumbling, and worst of all, he knew he was not alone in this. The world was full of people chasing the same illusions, hoping that the next milestone, the next victory, the next moment of recognition would finally bring them the peace they so desperately sought. Tolstoy was beginning to suspect a painful truth. Perhaps the things we are told to strive for are not the things that actually give life meaning. Determined to find an answer, Tolstoy did what he had always done best. He turned to deep analysis. If his own achievements had failed to provide meaning, perhaps the accomplishments of humanity as a whole could offer insight. He studied the greatest contributions of civilization: art, science, philosophy, politics, seeking some thread of meaning that could justify human existence. Yet, the more he examined these grand achievements, the more he saw their limitations. Science could explain how the world worked, but it could not explain why it existed in the first place. Art could express beauty and suffering, but it could not resolve the fundamental absurdity of life. Philosophy could question reality and construct elaborate systems of thought, but no philosopher had ever truly answered the question that tormented him. Why live if life is destined to end? Even morality, the foundation of human ethics, seemed powerless against the inevitability of death. If all human efforts were temporary, if every civilization eventually collapsed, if every human achievement faded into dust, then was it not all just a futile attempt to distract ourselves from the inescapable truth? Tolstoy saw that even the greatest minds of history had faced the same existential abyss, and none had conquered it. Some had accepted life's absurdity and lived as if meaning did not matter. Others had sought comfort in fleeting pleasures, but none of these answers satisfied him. He did not want an illusion. He wanted the truth, no matter how painful. And the truth, as it appeared to him at that moment, was terrifying. Human progress had given us knowledge, power, and art, but it had not given us meaning. If neither individual success nor collective achievement could provide the answer, then where else was there to look? Tolstoy began to reflect on those around him, his peers, the intellectuals, the artists, the aristocrats. Many of them lived in a state of quiet despair, though few admitted it openly. Some drowned their emptiness in indulgence, others in endless distractions. But beneath their polished exteriors, there was an unspoken truth. They were just as lost as he saw it in the scholars who prided themselves on their intellect, yet found no real joy in their discoveries. These were people who had everything society deemed valuable: money, status, admiration. Yet they wandered through life as if searching for something they could never quite grasp. The most terrifying realization was that many of them had stopped searching altogether. They had accepted their emptiness as the natural state of life and resigned themselves to it. Tolstoy, however, could not accept that answer. He refused to believe that life was nothing more than an elaborate performance, that the only options were distraction or despair. If there was no meaning in the world of success, then meaning had to exist somewhere else. But where? It was in this desperate search that Tolstoy began to look beyond his social class. If wealth and prestige had failed to provide an answer, perhaps the key lay in those who lived outside the illusions of privilege. He turned his gaze toward the working class, those who labored in the fields, who built homes with their hands, who lived without the comfort of intellectual justifications. These were people who, by all logic, should have been even more despairing than him. They had none of the luxuries, none of the status, none of the recognition that he had spent his life accumulating. And yet, something about them was different. They were not consumed by the same existential dread. They did not seem to question their own existence with the same agonizing doubt. Instead, they lived with a quiet acceptance, a deep-seated peace that eluded even the greatest minds of Tolstoy's generation. He was struck by the contrast. Why did the privileged, the intellectual, and the accomplished suffer from existential despair, while those with the least seemed to carry themselves with a calm certainty? What did these simple people know that the learned and powerful did not? This realization was the turning point. The answer to his search was not to be found in grand achievements, in intellectual triumphs, or in wealth. It was hidden somewhere he had never thought to look. And so, Tolstoy began to immerse himself in the lives of ordinary people, determined to understand the secret they carried. It was here, in the simplicity of life, that he would finally begin to uncover the truth he had been searching for all along. Tolstoy had spent years searching for meaning in places where he believed wisdom resided: literature, philosophy, science, and art. He had studied the greatest minds in history, seeking a truth profound enough to justify existence, but none of them provided an answer that truly satisfied him. The intellectuals debated, the artists expressed, the scientists analyzed, but they all avoided the fundamental question: why live if everything ends? In his despair, Tolstoy turned his attention to those whom he had previously overlooked: the peasants, the laborers, the ordinary people who lived far from the grandeur of aristocratic life. These were individuals without formal education, without wealth, without the luxury of existential contemplation. And yet, they did not question the meaning of their existence in the agonizing way Tolstoy had. This contrast struck him deeply. How could it be that those with the least knowledge of philosophy seemed to possess the greatest understanding of life? How did they wake up every morning without the crushing weight of existential dread? That they did not question life because they lacked the intellectual tools to do so. The more he realized that their peace did not come from a lack of understanding. It came from a wisdom far deeper than anything he had encountered in books. Tolstoy began to immerse himself in their world. He spent time with farmers who labored from dawn until dusk, with craftsmen who built with their hands, with mothers who carried generations forward through love and sacrifice. These people lived by an unspoken philosophy, one that was not written in books but practiced in their daily existence. They did not agonize over meaning because their lives were intertwined with it. Their purpose was not an abstract concept. It was lived through action, through duty, through relationships. A farmer did not ask if life had meaning. He simply woke up and tended his fields. A mother did not question whether love was real. She simply embraced her child. A craftsman did not debate whether his work was important. He simply shaped wood or metal into something useful. Their wisdom was not intellectual but experiential. While the intellectual class debated the purpose of existence, these people lived it. They found meaning not in grand theories, but in the changing of the seasons, in the birth of a child, in the passing of traditions from one generation to the next. Their philosophy was not one of words, but of being. Tolstoy realized that their way of life held an answer he had long overlooked. It is something to be lived. There was another aspect of their lives that fascinated Tolstoy: their faith. Almost without exception, these simple people believed in something greater than themselves. Whether it was Christianity, folk traditions, or an unshaken trust in the order of the universe, they lived with an innate sense of connection to the divine. They did not see themselves as isolated individuals struggling to create meaning from nothing. They saw themselves as part of a larger whole, woven into the fabric of existence itself. For years, Tolstoy had dismissed religion as a collection of outdated myths, useful only for those who could not face the harsh realities of life. But now, he began to see it differently. These people did not use faith as an escape. They used it as an anchor. Their belief in God, in moral duty, in the sacredness of life, gave them a strength that no philosophy had ever given him. They did not fear death in the way that he did, because they saw life as part of something eternal. This faith was not built on theological arguments or philosophical proofs. It was something they simply lived. To them, belief was not an intellectual choice. It was as natural as breathing. They did not struggle to define meaning because they embodied it. Tolstoy found himself deeply moved by this realization. Could it be that the very thing he had spent years rejecting was the key to the peace he had been searching for? This discovery marked a turning point in Tolstoy's life. He had always believed that true understanding could only come through intellectual rigor, through logic and reason. But now, he saw that there was another form of knowledge, one that could not be written down or analyzed, only experienced. These simple people had shown him a truth he had long ignored. It is something that emerges when one surrenders to life rather than trying to control it. It is found not in endless questioning, but in the act of living with purpose, love, and faith. Tolstoy's crisis had led him to the edge of despair, but in the simplicity of existence itself. And with this realization, he stood on the threshold of a new understanding, one that would change the course of his life forever. For years, Tolstoy had searched for meaning in wealth, fame, and intellectual pursuits, only to find them empty. He had turned to the great thinkers of history, hoping that philosophy or science would offer a satisfying answer. But none had. He had even reached the edge of despair, wondering if life was nothing more than a cruel joke, one that ended inevitably in death. But his journey had taken an unexpected turn. The answer he had spent years searching for was not hidden in complex theories or intellectual debates. It was something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. Tolstoy's revelation was simple yet profound. The meaning of life is not found in thought, but in the heart, not in the pursuit of personal greatness, but in connection with others, with the world, and with something greater than oneself. The philosophers and intellectuals of his time had tried to construct meaning through logic, but logic alone had failed him. The simple people, the peasants, the laborers, had shown him something deeper. Their lives were not built around personal ambition, but around duty, love, and faith. They did not analyze meaning, they lived it, and in doing so, they possessed a peace that had always eluded him. Tolstoy realized that he had been searching for something that could never be grasped by thought alone. Meaning was not a puzzle to be solved. It was a reality to be lived. And the more he embraced this idea, the more the despair that had once consumed him began to fade. With this revelation, Tolstoy underwent a profound transformation. He abandoned the belief that individual achievements could bring lasting fulfillment. Instead, he saw himself as part of a greater whole, woven into the fabric of existence itself. He began to view life not as a quest for personal success, but as an opportunity to serve, to love, and to contribute to something beyond himself. He turned away from the empty pursuits that had once defined his world. The hunger for recognition, the need to leave a legacy, the obsession with intellectual superiority. None of these things could provide the deep, unshakable sense of meaning he had found in the simplest aspects of existence. He wrote about his transformation in a book that laid bare his existential crisis and the journey that led him out of it. He described how he had once believed that meaning had to be created by the individual, only to realize that it had always existed. It was simply a matter of seeing it. Life, he concluded, was not an intellectual riddle to be solved. It was an act of surrender. Tolstoy's revelation was not just personal. It reshaped his entire worldview. His later works took on a different tone. Where his earlier novels explored the complexities of human nature, his later writings sought to strip life down to its essence. He became deeply concerned with moral and spiritual questions, often clashing with the Russian Orthodox Church and the aristocracy as he championed ideas of simplicity, humility, and nonviolence. He renounced his former wealth and began dressing like a peasant. He gave away much of his property, lived in a modest way, and advocated for the rights of the poor. He no longer believed in the power of institutions or governments to create a just world, only in the power of individuals to live with integrity and love. His final years were marked by a radical commitment to his newfound philosophy. He rejected the trappings of privilege and embraced a way of life that mirrored the wisdom of the simple people he had once overlooked. In doing so, he found something he had never felt in his years of success: peace. He no longer feared death because he no longer saw himself as separate from life itself. He had let go of the illusion of control and embraced the truth that meaning was not something to be achieved, but something to be lived. Tolstoy's journey is one that speaks to the deepest fears and longings of the human heart. In an age where we are constantly told that meaning comes from personal success, from recognition, from intellectual mastery, his story offers a different perspective. It suggests that perhaps meaning is not something we have to chase. Perhaps it is already here, in the love we give, in the kindness we show, in the simple act of being present. Tolstoy's revelation was not the answer he had expected. It was not a grand philosophical theory, nor a secret formula for happiness. It was, instead, a truth so simple that it had been overlooked. Life's meaning is not in what we think, it is in how we live. If this video resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It really helps bring these deep conversations to more people. We explore profound questions about philosophy, self-discovery, and the human experience every day. So make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Thank you for being part of this journey. See you in the next one.